He was a licensed barber, married 9 days after graduation, never planned to wrestle a single match. 62 years later, he had wrestled 15,000 of them. He headlined Madison Square Garden. He held the longest tag team title reign of his era. And when the pretty boy gimmick stopped working, he grew a beard down to his chest, started kissing grandmothers, and became an even bigger star than before. They called him Handsome Jimmy Valiant. They called him the Boogie Woogie Man. This is his story. James Harold Fanning was born on August 6, 1942, in a small town called Tullahoma, Tennessee, nestled in Franklin County in the rural heart of the American South. He was the youngest of 5 children born to James and Effie Fanning. He had 4 older sisters, Louise, Christine, Charlena, and Patricia, and later in life he would honor each of them by incorporating their names into the spiderweb tattoo on his upper arm. It was a gesture that tells you something important about who this man was underneath all the showmanship and the bleached blonde hair and the 100-decibel promos. Family mattered, roots mattered, where you came from mattered, but where James Fanning came from was humble, deeply, bone-achingly humble. His father was a blue-collar working man in every sense of the word. Hard-working and reliable, the kind of man who clocked in, clocked out, put food on the table, and did not complain about it. Young James grew up watching his father grind through the same routine day after day, year after year, and even as a kid he knew that he wanted something different. Not because he looked down on his father. He respected the man enormously, but because there was something inside James Fanning that burned too hot for a factory floor or an office desk. Something restless and electric and impossible to contain. The family eventually settled in Hammond, Indiana, a working-class city just outside Chicago. And it was there, in the blue-collar neighborhoods of the industrial Midwest, that young James Fanning spent his formative years. He was a typical kid in a lot of ways. He liked cars, he liked girls, he liked football, he played on the gridiron at Hammond Tech High School and was good enough to earn some respect, but not good enough to turn it into a career. When he graduated in 1961, he found himself standing at the same crossroads that every 18-year-old from a working-class family faces. Go to college for 4 years and hope it leads somewhere, or get a blue-collar job like his old man and start punching the clock. Hammond was home, but choices were limited. James Fanning chose option 3. He enrolled at Moeller's Barber College in Chicago. He was going to become a barber, and honestly, he was pretty good at it. He graduated on June 14, 1962, a fully licensed barber ready to start cutting hair for a living. 9 days later, he got married. Life was moving fast. He had a trade, a wife, and a plan. The plan did not include professional wrestling. Married and licensed, he seemed set. But life has a way of ignoring your plans. After graduating from barber school, Fanning took a job at a health club in the Chicago area called Acres Health Club. The owner was a man named Mr. Zeller, a straightforward enough name for a straightforward enough business. Fanning worked hard. He impressed his boss. He built relationships with the regulars. Then one day Mr. Zeller called him into his office and made him an offer that would change the trajectory of his entire life. Zeller offered Fanning a full-time position managing the health club, and then, almost as an afterthought, he offered to train him as a professional wrestler. Mr. Zeller had a secret identity. Outside the health club, he was known as Boris Volkov, one half of a wrestling tag team called the Volkov Brothers. His partner, Steve Gobb, wrestled under the name Nikolai Volkov, a man who had been a member of the 1940 Olympic weightlifting team. These were old-school, tough-as-nails men from a generation of wrestling that valued conditioning and legitimacy above all else. They saw something in young James Fanning, something worth developing, something worth investing time in. For several months, Fanning trained under Zeller and another old-school wrestler named Bobby Manigoff. He learned the basics: how to take a bump, how to throw a punch that looks devastating but protects your opponent, how to work a crowd, how to tell a story with your body. It was grueling, repetitive, unglamorous work, the kind of apprenticeship that separates the men who want to be wrestlers from the men who are going to be wrestlers. On May 5, 1964, James Harold Fanning made his professional wrestling debut at St. Andrew's Gymnasium in Chicago. He wrestled under the name Big Jim Valiant. He was 21 years old. He was nobody. He had no name recognition, no following, no gimmick that meant anything to anyone. He was just another green kid trying to break into the most unforgiving business in the world. But he could work, and in the wrestling business, if you can work and if you are willing to drive, the road will find a place for you. Dick the Bruiser, the legendary wrestler and promoter who ran the World Wrestling Association out of Indianapolis, started booking young Fanning on untelevised house shows. Twice a week at first, then 3 times, then 5 times, then more. Fanning was living out of his car, driving hundreds of miles between small-town arenas and high school gymnasiums, wrestling in front of crowds that ranged from a few dozen to a few hundred. He was learning the business the only way you can truly learn it, by doing it. Night after night after night, in front of paying customers who would let you know in no uncertain terms whether you were any good or not. It was during this period that Fanning's ring name went through several iterations. He was Jimmy Valentine for a while, he was John Vallon, he was Big Jim this and that. Nothing stuck, nothing felt right, and then in 1969 he found himself working in Dallas for Fritz von Erich. Von Erich was a no-nonsense promoter who ran his territory with an iron fist, and he took one look at young Fanning's various ring names and shook his head. Vallon was too close to Valentine, and there was already a Johnny Valentine in the business. Von Erich did not deliberate. He did not hold focus groups or brainstorming sessions. He just looked at Fanning and said it. "You are Jimmy Valiant." And that was that. The name that would echo through wrestling arenas for the next 60 years was born in a single sentence from a Texas promoter who did not have time for confusion. From Dallas, word of this handsome, athletic young heel reached the most powerful wrestling promotion in the country. Vincent J. McMahon, the father of the man who would later reshape the entire wrestling industry, called Fritz von Erich, looking for a strapping, good-looking wrestler to fill a spot in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. Von Erich recommended Valiant, and in June of 1971, Jimmy Valiant made his debut at the most famous wrestling venue on the planet, Garden. He went to a 15-minute draw with beautiful Bobby Harmon in his first Madison Square Garden appearance. It was not a main event, it was not a title match, but it was Madison Square Garden, and for a kid from Hammond, Indiana, who had been cutting hair in Chicago less than a decade earlier, it was proof that the impossible was possible. Valiant entered the Worldwide Wrestling Federation as a babyface, originally billed as Gentleman Jim Valiant. He was good-looking, well-built, and had a natural charisma that connected with audiences. But Valiant knew himself. He knew that his real talent lay on the dark side of the business. He wanted to be a heel, a villain, the guy the crowd wanted to see get destroyed. Vince McMahon Sr. preferred a slow build, but eventually the turn came. Valiant betrayed the beloved Chief Jay Strongbow in the middle of a match. And just like that, handsome Jimmy Valiant the heel was born. And what a heel he was. Bleached blonde hair, a body he clearly spent serious time sculpting, an arrogance that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. He strutted, he preened, he looked at the fans with undisguised contempt. He was one of the first blonde pretty boy heels in wrestling, a template that would be used by dozens of wrestlers who came after him. When you look at Ric Flair or Buddy Landel or any of the other golden-haired villains who dominated the 1980s, you are looking at the legacy of handsome Jimmy Valiant. But it was in tag team wrestling that Valiant found his first taste of real championship-level success. In the World Wrestling Association, he crossed paths with Bobby Heenan, the legendary manager who had an eye for talent that bordered on the supernatural. Heenan was looking for a replacement tag team partner for Valiant, and during a scouting trip to London, Ontario, they found one. A young wrestler named John L. Sullivan, who would become known to the world as Luscious Johnny Valiant. Jimmy and Johnny were not actually related. They were kayfabe brothers, a fiction maintained by the wrestling business with the same seriousness that a magician maintains his secrets. But the chemistry between them was real, undeniable, explosive. They looked like brothers, they moved like brothers, they fought like brothers. The Valiant brothers became one of the hottest tag teams in wrestling almost overnight. On January the 5th, 1974, Jimmy and Johnny defeated Dick the Bruiser and Bruno Sammartino to win the World Wrestling Association World Tag Team Championship. Think about that. Bruno Sammartino, the living legend, the man who held the Worldwide Wrestling Federation Championship for nearly 8 years. And the Valiant brothers pinned his team. That is how good they were. 4 months later, they moved to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation and made an even bigger splash. On May 8, 1974, Jimmy and Johnny defeated Tony Garea and Dean Ho to capture the Worldwide Wrestling Federation World Tag Team Championship. They held those belts for 370 days, the longest tag team title reign of its era. A record that would not be broken for 14 years when Demolition finally surpassed it. For over a year, the Valiant brothers were the most dominant tag team in the most powerful wrestling promotion in the world. They main-evented Madison Square Garden against Bruno Sammartino and Chief Jay Strongbow. They cut promos that dripped with arrogance and menace. They were everything a great heel tag team should be. But all partnerships end. After 5 years together, Jimmy and Johnny went their separate ways. And it is worth noting something that gets lost in the shuffle of championship reigns and territory hopping. Despite being heels, despite being the guys the crowd was supposed to hate, the Valiant brothers were occasionally cheered. There was something about them, about their swagger, about the sheer conviction of their performances that made people respond even when they were supposed to be booing. That is the mark of a truly great heel. When the audience cannot help but respect you even as they despise you. Johnny would go on to manage some of the biggest names in the business, including Hulk Hogan and the Dream Team. But Jimmy had no interest in standing on the apron holding someone else's towel. He was a performer, a wrestler, and he was about to enter the most important and transformative chapter of his career. In the late 1970s, Jimmy Valiant headed south to Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis wrestling in the late 1970s and the early 1980s was something special. It was run out of the Mid-South Coliseum and broadcast by the incomparable Lance Russell, and it was the hottest territorial promotion in the country. The king of Memphis wrestling was Jerry Lawler, and Valiant walked right into a feud with him that would become legendary. Valiant was still working as Handsome Jimmy at this point, still the bleached blonde heel with the big body and the bigger ego. He feuded with Lawler repeatedly, and the two of them tore the house down night after night. But Valiant also showed a different side of himself in Memphis. He teamed with Bill Dundee and dominated the tag team scene. He recorded a song called The Ballad of Handsome Jimmy that actually got radio play on Memphis stations. He was so over with the Memphis audience, so embedded in the culture of that city, that the promotion offered to buy him a house just to keep him there full-time. According to Lawler's own biography, they were that desperate to hold on to him. Valiant held the AWA Southern Heavyweight Championship for roughly a year. He was, for a time, one of the biggest stars in one of the biggest territories. But Jimmy Valiant was not the kind of man who stayed in one place for long. He moved on. He had a brief stint in Jim Crockett Promotions as the heel king, James Valiant, managed by Lord Alfred Hayes. He bounced back to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation for a while, transitioning from wrestler to manager. He was restless, searching, and then something happened that would change everything. He arrived in Jim Crockett Promotions in the early 1980s and looked around at the landscape. And what he saw was a territory full of handsome, bleached blonde pretty boys. Ric Flair was there, just hitting his stride as the nature boy. Buddy Landel was there, doing his own version of the golden-haired heel. The handsome villain gimmick that Valiant had pioneered was now being done by younger, fresher faces. Ole Anderson, the booker, pulled Valiant aside and suggested, in his characteristically blunt manner, that a change might be in order. And this is where the story of Jimmy Valiant becomes truly remarkable. Because what he did next was something that very few wrestlers in the history of the business have ever done successfully. He completely reinvented himself from the ground up. He did not tweak his character. He did not adjust his look. He burned the whole thing down and built something entirely new from the ashes. He threw away his razor. He grew his hair long and wild. He grew a beard that would have made ZZ Top jealous. He traded the designer clothes and the arrogant sneer for bandanas and overalls and a grin that could light up an entire arena. He started dancing. Not subtle, cool, I am too sexy for this ring dancing. Full body, uninhibited, I do not care what anyone thinks dancing. He danced down the aisle. He danced in the ring. He danced on the way back to the locker room. His entrance music was Boy from New York City by the Manhattan Transfer, and if you were a wrestling fan in the early 1980s, you cannot hear that song to this day without thinking of Jimmy Valiant. And the kissing. He kissed everybody. Men, women, children, grandparents, it did not matter. Green, black, blue, white. He kissed everyone. He grabbed people and planted one on them, and the crowd went absolutely insane every single time. Nobody was doing this. Nobody had ever done this. In an era of tough guys and villains and stoic heroes who barely cracked a smile, here was this wild-eyed, long-bearded hippie dancing down the aisle, kissing everything in sight, and calling his fans the street people. The Boogie Woogie Man was born, and professional wrestling would never be the same. In Jim Crockett Promotions, which covered North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and was steadily expanding, the Boogie Woogie Man became one of the most beloved babyfaces in the entire National Wrestling Alliance. His popularity was not based on technical wrestling ability. Valiant himself would be the first to tell you that he was never a mat technician. His moveset was limited. Chops, headlocks, an elbow drop, a thumb to the throat. Nothing that would make the pages of a wrestling instruction manual. But professional wrestling has never been exclusively about moves. It is about connection. It is about making the people in the arena feel something. And nobody, absolutely nobody, connected with an audience the way Jimmy Valiant did. Working-class fans saw themselves in Valiant. He was not polished. He was not pretty anymore. He was rough around the edges and loud and a little bit crazy, and that was exactly what made him perfect. He was their guy, their champion, the man who fought for the people who could not fight for themselves. He called them his street people, and they loved him for it. In 1983, something happened that proved just how over Valiant was. He lost a Leavestown match in Jim Crockett Promotions and was kayfabe banished from the territory. So he came back under a mask, calling himself Charlie Brown from Outer Town. It was one of the most absurd disguises in wrestling history. He wore a mask over the top half of his face, but his legendary, enormous, instantly recognizable beard was hanging right there for everyone to see. Nobody was fooled. Not the fans, not the other wrestlers, not the announcers. But the crowd went along with it because they loved Valiant so much that they were willing to suspend every last ounce of disbelief just to keep seeing him on their television screens every week. And as Charlie Brown, he actually won a championship. At Starrcade 1983, the very first Starrcade, the NWA's answer to WrestleMania, Charlie Brown from Outer Town defeated the Great Kabuki to win the NWA Mid-Atlantic Television Championship. He put his mask on the line and won the title. It was a moment that perfectly captured the absurd, wonderful, only in professional wrestling magic of Jimmy Valiant's career. But the defining chapter of the Boogie Woogie Man's run in Jim Crockett Promotions was his feud with Paul Jones. And it was a feud that would last nearly 3 years and produce some of the most memorable moments in the history of Mid-Atlantic wrestling. In January of 1984, Valiant was attacked by Paul Jones and his clients, the Assassins. They tied Valiant to the ring ropes, and while he was helpless, Jones cut off his beard. His beard, the symbol of the Boogie Woogie Man, the thing that made him who he was. In kayfabe terms, it was an act of war. In real terms, it was the spark that ignited one of the greatest feuds in National Wrestling Alliance history. The response was a super show called Boogie Man Jam 1984 in Greensboro, North Carolina. For the grudge match, Dusty Rhodes stood in Valiant's corner, literally tied by a rope to Paul Jones so that neither manager could interfere without dragging the other with him. Valiant defeated Assassin 2, who was unmasked and revealed as Hercules Hernandez. The crowd went ballistic. Justice had been served, but Paul Jones was not done, not even close. Over the next 3 years, Jones built an army of wrestlers to wage war against the Boogie Woogie Man. And what an army it was. The Barbarian, Baron von Raschke, Tejo Khan, the Assassins, Abdullah the Butcher. One by one, Paul Jones recruited the most dangerous, most feared men in professional wrestling and pointed them all at Jimmy Valiant. And Valiant fought them all. He fought them in singles matches. He fought them in tag matches. He fought them in street fights and dog collar matches and hair versus hair matches. He received help along the way from Hector Guerrero and Manny Fernandez, the Raging Bull, with whom he formed a tag team called the B&B Connection, which stood for Boogie Woogie and Bull. Together they battled the Paul Jones army across the Carolinas and Virginia, filling arenas and selling tickets by the truckload. The feud had its setbacks. At Starrcade 1984, Valiant lost a loser, Leavestown tuxedo street fight to Paul Jones. But even losing could not keep the Boogie Woogie Man down. He kept coming back, kept fighting, kept dancing. In 1985, at the Great American Bash, he defeated Paul Jones in a dog collar match. In 1986, he beat Shaska Whatley in a hair versus hair match. But then, in one of the most gut-wrenching betrayals in wrestling history, his best friend Manny Fernandez accepted money from Paul Jones and turned on Valiant. The Raging Bull, the man who had fought beside him for years, sold him out. The war between Valiant and Paul Jones climaxed at Starrcade 1986 in a no disqualification match where Valiant put the hair of his valet Big Mama on the line against the hair of Paul Jones. The Raging Bull was suspended in a cage above the ring so he could not interfere. Valiant won. He shaved Paul Jones bald. The crowd lost its collective mind. It was the perfect ending to one of the longest, most emotionally invested feuds in the history of the National Wrestling Alliance. After the Paul Jones saga concluded, Valiant continued in Jim Crockett Promotions, teaming with Hector Guerrero, who was masked as Lasertron, and Bugsy McGraw. He feuded with the New Breed. But by the late 1980s, the landscape of professional wrestling was changing. Jim Crockett Promotions was being absorbed into Ted Turner's World Championship Wrestling, and the territory system that had sustained wrestlers like Valiant for decades was dying. When Crockett became World Championship Wrestling, Valiant left and returned to Memphis. In Memphis, the wheel came full circle. He was back feuding with Jerry Lawler, the same man he had battled a decade earlier. In 1990, he twice won the USWA Unified World Heavyweight Championship from Lawler, and he lost it back both times. The matches were not the same as they had been in the late 1970s. Both men were older now, carrying the weight of thousands of miles and thousands of matches on their bodies. But the connection with the audience was still there. The magic was still there. It always was, with Jimmy Valiant. Through the 1990s, Valiant continued to wrestle, primarily on the independent circuit. The big arenas were gone. The national television audiences were gone. He was working in high school gymnasiums and VFW halls, in front of crowds that sometimes numbered in the dozens rather than the thousands. His body had changed dramatically. The muscular physique of Handsome Jimmy was a distant memory. He was leaner now, almost gaunt, the years of constant travel and physical punishment having taken their inevitable toll. But here is the thing about Jimmy Valiant. He never stopped. He never quit. He never looked at a half-empty gymnasium and decided it was beneath him. Because for Jimmy Valiant, Professional wrestling was never about the size of the building or the number of people in the seats. It was about the connection. It was about that moment when the music hits and you walk through the curtain and somebody, even if it is just one person, lights up because they are happy to see you. That was enough. That was always enough. In 1996, Jimmy and Johnny Valiant were inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame by Owen Hart and the British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith. They were the very first tag team ever inducted into the Hall. The very first. Out of all the legendary tag teams in wrestling history, the Road Warriors, the Midnight Express, the British Bulldogs, the Hart Foundation, and every other great team that has ever laced up a pair of boots, the Valiant brothers were the first ones honored. That tells you something about the impact they had on the business. In the years that followed, Valiant settled in Shawsville, Virginia, in the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains, and opened Boogie's wrestling camp. He started training the next generation of wrestlers, passing on the knowledge he had accumulated over tens of thousands of matches and millions of miles. He was not just teaching moves, he was teaching philosophy. How to connect with a crowd, how to tell a story, how to make people care. These are things that cannot be taught in a textbook. They can only be learned from a man who has lived them. He kept wrestling on the independent circuit well into his 70s. He appeared at Wrestle Reunion events. He worked with small promotions across the southeastern United States. In 2020, at the age of 77, he wrestled for WrestlePro in New Jersey. In 2022, at 79, he won a 6-man tag team match in South Carolina. In 2023, at 80, he wrestled in North Carolina. The man simply would not stop. Tragically, not everyone from Valiant's world was as fortunate. His kayfabe brother Johnny Valiant was killed on April 4, 2018, when he was struck by a pickup truck in Pittsburgh. He was 71 years old. Jerry Valiant, the third brother who had joined the team in the late 1970s, died in 2010 after a battle with advanced Alzheimer's brought on by post-concussion syndrome. The wrestling business has always exacted a brutal toll on the men and women who dedicate their lives to it, and the Valiant brothers were no exception. Jimmy carried on. He always carried on. That was what he did. Through the losses and the heartbreaks, through the physical deterioration and the changing of the guard, Jimmy Valiant kept going. He kept driving, he kept wrestling, he kept dancing. When you look back at the career of Jimmy Valiant, what stands out is not any single match or any single championship or any single moment. What stands out is the totality of it. The sheer, staggering, incomprehensible scope of a career that spanned 7 decades, from the 1960s through the 2020s. He claims to have had over 15,000 matches. He drove millions of miles on American highways. He sometimes wrestled 365 days a year, twice on Saturdays and Sundays. And through all of that, he reinvented himself in a way that almost no wrestler has ever done. The handsome Jimmy Valiant of the 1970s and the Boogie Woogie Man of the 1980s are so completely different that they could be two entirely different people. One was a vain, arrogant, bleached blonde villain who strutted around like he owned every arena he walked into. The other was a wild, bearded, dancing hippie who kissed grandmothers and called his fans the street people and entered arenas to the sound of the Manhattan Transfer while the crowd sang along at the top of their lungs. Most wrestlers cannot pull off one great character in their entire career. Jimmy Valiant pulled off 2, and both of them drew money. He was never going to be confused with Ric Flair in the ring. He was never going to have a 5-star match with Ricky Steamboat. That was not his game. His game was making you feel something, making you care, making you want to see him win so badly that you would drive an hour to a high school gymnasium on a Tuesday night just to watch him dance down an aisle, throw an elbow drop, and kiss a grandmother on the way back to the locker room. That is a talent that cannot be taught, cannot be manufactured, and cannot be faked. Either you have it or you do not. Jimmy Valiant had it in abundance. He also did something else that deserves recognition, something that often gets overlooked in discussions about his career. He was one of the first wrestlers to make entrance music an integral part of a wrestling show. Before Jimmy Valiant, entrance music was an afterthought. A few wrestlers had theme songs, but it was not the theatrical, choreographed production that it is today. Valiant coming out to boy. From New York City, dancing and strutting and working the crowd into a frenzy before the match even started, helped establish the idea that the entrance itself could be a performance, that the show started the moment the music hit, not when the bell rang. Every dramatic entrance you see in wrestling today, every carefully chosen song, every choreographed walk to the ring owes a debt to the Boogie Woogie Man. On April 25, 2026, Jimmy Valiant wrestled what he has declared to be his final match. They called it Boogie's Last Dance. It took place in Lancaster, South Carolina, under the banner of the NAWA promotion. Valiant teamed with Magnet Man and the Moonshine Express to defeat VSP and Dion Johnson in an 8-man tag team match. He was 83 years old. 83, he danced down the aisle to his theme song one last time. He did his thing. He gave the people what they came to see. Over 6 decades, he went from a kid who trained in a Chicago health club to a main eventer at Madison Square Garden, to one of the most hated heels in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, to the most beloved babyface in the NWA, to a Hall of Famer, to a trainer of the next generation. He lost friends along the way. He lost family. His daughter Rhonda passed away in 2016. His kayfabe brothers are gone. The territories he made his name in have been dead for decades. The world he grew up in, the world of 6-hour television tapings and 100-mile drives between house shows and smoky arenas packed with people who believed with every fiber of their being that what they were watching was real. That world does not exist anymore. But Jimmy Valiant still exists, and the memories he created still exist. And the people he touched, the fans who stood in those arenas and sang along to Boy from New York City and screamed themselves hoarse as the Boogie Woogie Man danced his way to the ring, those people still carry those memories with them. They still smile when they think about it. They still feel that warmth, that joy, that sense of belonging that Jimmy Valiant created every single time he walked through a curtain. That is the real legacy of handsome Jimmy Valiant. Not the championships, though there were plenty of those. Not the Hall of Fame induction, though that was richly deserved. Not the record-breaking tag team title reign, or the 3-year war with Paul Jones, or the absurdity of Charlie Brown from out of town and his very visible beard. The real legacy is simpler than all of that. It is the fact that for 62 years, through every change and every challenge and every mile on every highway, one man never stopped trying to make people happy, never stopped dancing, never stopped kissing grandmothers, never stopped being the Boogie Woogie Man. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into the legends of professional wrestling. Until next time.